So, if you want to learn about how children were punished when they misbehaved, how America practically copied another country's entire education model, and how other countries such as Korea and Argentina would do things differently, stay tuned. We'll also be showing the difference between urban and rural America, and how a lot of the things that make the South what it is simply lead to a suboptimal education. If you were like the majority of students, then chances are that you got to enjoy the thrills of the public school system. Built in order to spread literacy and standardize a good education for all, the system has come a long way in the past 120-odd years. So today, we're going to transport you back in time so that you can get a glimpse of what school was like all those years ago. But before we begin, if you're fascinated in history, you may also be generous enough to provide us with a little bit of extra support. If you're interested in early access to videos and live chats with the creator of Intrigued Mind, consider subscribing to our Patreon. Your support will be integral in helping to keep the channel producing more intriguing content. While we could make a multi-hour documentary that covers all schooling systems in all countries, for today, we're going to mostly be focusing on the good old US of A. However, if you're not from the USA, don't worry. We're going to be comparing the American experience to that of countries in other parts of the world later on in this video. Now, by 1900, the USA had more or less established a national public school system. While the system wasn't perfect, after all, just 78% of all American children between the ages of 5 and 17 were enrolled. It was still pretty good in a world where many developed countries had numbers that were far lower. However, the United States is a pretty big place, so as you might expect, exactly how a public school operated depended a lot on location. That's why we're going to split our analysis into two parts, one for rural schools and another for urban. While rural parents certainly cared about their children's education, one thing reigned supreme: the farming season. During this time period, child labor laws were in their infancy, and so it was common for children to help with farm work as soon as they were old enough to. The problem with this was that this meant that school had to be adjusted so that kids would actually attend. Rather than have school all year, breaks had to be created so that the kids could spend certain parts of the year working on the farm. While exactly what these breaks looked like depended on geography, the modern summer break actually originated back during this time period. Kids would take the summer off not to relax, but to help on the farm. And while most kids are no longer in this situation, the break has continued to this very day. Sometimes, breaks would also be necessary at other times of the year, as the laying of the seeds in the spring and the harvest in the fall was often a massive job for farm families and required all hands on deck. On a day-to-day basis, the amount of time rural kids spent in class was also lower. While this would change throughout the early 1900s to the 1930s as schools became standardized across the country, it was normal for rural kids to be in school for fewer hours per day than urban kids. The actual school structure was also radically different. While modern schools now consist of multiple teachers in multiple classrooms, most rural areas simply didn't have the money, resources, or staff to pull off such a large operation. Therefore, it was instead the norm for kids to be in a one-room schoolhouse. Often serving the dual role of being both a church and community meeting hall, these buildings were built across rural America. While there wasn't much in the way of standardized grades just yet, generally speaking, kindergarten until the equivalent of around grades 6 to 8 would all be in one building. Usually, the actual teacher on hand would spend most of their time on the oldest students, while these students would then supervise and help teach the youngest in a sort of trickle-down system. In terms of learning methods, rote memorization and repetition was the norm, with the efficacy of this model being questionable at best. If you were wealthy and looking to get more than a simple middle school education, private institutions were usually the way to go. While some public high schools did exist in rural areas, the norm was for well-off families to send their kids away to boarding schools. On a macro scale, the privilege of a high school education would only be afforded to about 14% of all students in the early 20th century. For those from truly elite families or with stellar academic records, a stint in college would be the next and final step. In any case, no matter which of these schools you went to, one thing was a constant: the distance from school. In an era before cars were mass-produced, it was not uncommon for poor rural children to have to walk 5 miles each way to and from school. For wealthier students, they would usually get the option to stay on campus. However, spending months away from parents would often leave children feeling alone and isolated. It should also be noted that teachers did not shy away from corporal punishment. After all, it was not unusual for kids to be spanked at home, so it was common to be paddled, lashed, or have their palms or knuckles wrapped with a ruler at school. It's also worth mentioning that during this time period, this type of situation was the norm for most kids. That's because in 1900, 60% of America was still rural. Of course, this leaves us with one important question: what about urban kids? How was school different for students in cities at the turn of the 20th century? Well, the most important difference was the simple fact that any reforms and improvements to the education system would quite naturally happen in cities with more resources and larger populations far before they reached the rural and less regulated states in the South and Midwest. For example, due to the presence of more teachers, urban students were generally grouped in classrooms according to age. Their school year would also be far longer, and due to their lack of farm commitments, would generally have less seasonal breaks, lates, and absences. They also had better access to higher education. While this gave no guarantees, after all, many children had to end school after their elementary years to work and support their families. The simple presence of high schools and universities nearby made the idea of attending them far more palatable. Since cities were often industrial centers, there was also a greater emphasis on preparing students for industrial jobs. This meant that skills such as literacy and numeracy became all the more important since these skills were necessary to move up the corporate ladder. Interestingly enough, this was all based on the Prussian model, which was seen as the golden standard at the time due to its role in helping to bring Prussia into the industrial age. This model dictated that public school not only had to be free, but organized into grades, standardized with curriculums and testing, morphed into accountable administrative units, and made as efficient as possible to dispel as much information as possible in the shortest amount of time. And now that we're on the topic of foreign countries, you may be wondering, what was schooling like for those who lived outside of the United States? To analyze this, we're going to be looking at the school systems of Italy, Korea, and Argentina. Italy was an interesting case. While certainly an industrialized country, it was still largely rural. Italy was also a relatively new country. After all, it had only been formed in 1861, and by 1900 had a literacy rate that hovered around 50%. What this all meant was that the state was slowly but surely expanding its reach across the peninsula, and in 1900, the law of the land surrounding public education was Law 3725. This mandated just 4 years of free, state-sponsored education, which was barely enough for those who went to achieve literacy. However, in 1904, this law was extended to include all children under the age of 12, although even this was not always strictly enforced. Korea, on the other hand, did things quite differently. At the time, the country had not yet been split in two, and generally speaking, there were two forms of schools. In urban areas, schools were largely funded by a mix of government agents, patriots, and missionaries. However, in the countryside, a more traditional system prevailed. In essence, a local intellectual would set up a school in his home's reception room, known as a saraang. Each family who sent kids would pay however much they could reasonably afford alongside the expectation of a gift around the holidays. In return, the intellectual would hold literacy and numeracy classes where strict expectations of obedience were expected. In areas that were very poor, families could not always afford to contribute any form of tuition towards their children's education. If this was the case, they would be sent to a boarding school often far from home, where the donations and generosity of the local community would help sustain a school for them. And finally, in Argentina, the school system was quite advanced by the year 1900. In the late 1800s, a series of aggressive educational expansion projects meant that over 1,000 primary schools were set up, alongside schools for agriculture, schools for the handicapped, and a military college and naval school. These were complemented by hundreds of private schools that were set up by both private citizens and the Catholic Church. And all the while, educators were brought in to set up teacher training schools and kindergartens. Since education was also mandatory for all kids aged 6 to 14 during that period, literacy rates skyrocketed, and by 1900, Argentina had a relatively admirable school system. So now, we bounce it back to you. What are your thoughts on school back then? Do you think our system is better today, or are there some important lessons that we can learn from the past? Let us know in the comments down below. And of course, if you'd like more videos about the most amazing forgotten parts of our history, be sure to subscribe to the Intrigued Mind channel. Like the video, and leave your suggestions in the comments below.